Every time the property market crashes, people say the same thing. No one saw that coming. But the truth is, after you look at over 2,000 years worth of property data, you start to see it coming. There is a pattern, and it's actually not new. But once you know what to look out for, it's almost eerie how predictable it is. I'm an economist and I've built a portfolio of 6 properties, and I honestly believe that I've released more free property data than anyone else in New Zealand. So in this video, we're going to count down the 7 biggest property crashes in the history of the entire world and what always happens before a major property crash. Now, the 7th largest property crash in history was the Great Depression in the United States, where house prices fell 30 to 35%. Now, leading up to the crash, American house prices took off. It was the roaring 20s. The world had just come out of the First World War, and we were all feeling pretty optimistic, so housing was hot. People were earning more money, and mortgages, they were easy to get. Cities were expanding, and then the stock market bubble popped. People had borrowed a lot of money to buy stocks that they didn't really understand, and so stock prices dropped and panic set in. Eventually, the market collapsed. In fact, 25% of Americans lost their jobs. That meant they couldn't afford their mortgages, so they stopped paying them, and the banks eventually stopped lending. And over 4 years, those house prices did fall around about 35%. It was actually one of the worst economic disasters in the United States history. So when you're trying to spot a house market crash before it happens, look out for a sudden house price boom before the bubble bursts. But what actually burst the bubble in this example was actually first the job market, because when people can't afford a mortgage, they stop buying houses, housing demand goes down, and prices, they eventually crash. But more importantly, watch out for the banks, because house prices are really held up by the banks lending money, and when they fall over or tighten the purse strings, that's when house prices start falling. And you actually see that in the 6th largest property crash in history. But just before we get to that, if you want to make smarter property investment decisions, you need to create your free Opus Plus account, because this is how you can run the numbers on any investment property, stress test it, and see how it holds up under different scenarios. I actually built this for you guys on the channel. The link is down in the description. Now, the 6th largest house price crash in history was actually pretty recent, because back in the 2000s, Ireland's economy was flying high. Funding was pouring in from the European Union, and it was easy to get a home loan, and there was this massive building boom. In just 10 years, Irish house prices went up 270%. That's an average of 14% a year. And so what do developers start doing? They start building fast. In fact, people were selling homes before they were even finished, and buyers believed that prices would just keep going up and up and up, and the banks were doling out cash, giving out mortgages really freely. But then 2008 rolls around, the GFC hits, and Lehman Brothers, a big American bank, starts collapsing. And once again, the banks stop lending. Now, that probably sounds very familiar to what happened during the Great Depression. No one could borrow, so no one could buy. Developers fell over, and house prices, they started going down. And I mean way down. Irish house prices fell up to 56%. So, what happened directly before the crash? Well, firstly, we got a massive boom in property prices, followed by the banks clamping down, not lending out as much money. Now, there was an extra twist in Ireland, which was overbuilding, because all of that extra housing supply that developers were creating, that doesn't go away when house prices go down. But these housing market crashes do create some opportunities. Now, let's say you could time the market perfectly and you bought an Irish house right at the bottom of the market. Well, fast forward to today, you would have doubled your money. But while the Irish house price crash was big, the 5th largest house price crash in world history was even bigger. Before 1997, Hong Kong was part of the United Kingdom. But then in 1997, it got handed back to China. And people thought that Hong Kong would absolutely thrive. So before the handover happened, people rushed in to buy property, and property prices doubled. Now, are you noticing a bit of a pattern here? A big boom always comes before a big drop. And the big drop did eventually come. Shortly after Hong Kong got handed back, the Asian financial crisis hit. Now, people often ask, well, what was the Asian financial crisis? So in simple terms, countries like Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia, they'd borrowed a lot of money in US dollars. But then what happened was their economy slowed and they were struggling to pay it back. So what do investors do? They panicked and they started pulling their money out. And so those Asian currencies like the Thai baht halved in value overnight. Now, what does that mean? This is important. Let's say you needed 25 million Thai baht to pay back $1 million worth of US debt. Now that your currency has lost half its value, now you need 50 million Thai baht just to pay back the same amount of debt because your currency is not worth as much. And this happened to a lot of Asian countries. Now, what's the effect of all of that? Interest rates soared and some people's mortgage payments doubled overnight. So what does that have to do with Hong Kong? Buyers started getting out, sellers slashed their prices, and over 6 years, home values in Hong Kong dropped by 61%. In fact, it took 6 years of a downward market before prices finally started to just inch a little higher. And you again see that pattern. We have a boom, mortgages start to get more expensive or tougher to get, and property prices start to crash. It can take years before you start to get that recovery. But it's not always easy mortgages that cause the housing market to eventually come crashing down, as we see in the fourth largest house price drop in history. In the early 1700s, Amsterdam was the trade hub of Europe. So there were rich traders who speculated on the houses that are like right next to the canals. And they'd often buy these houses and sell them really quickly for a profit. Now, Dutch house prices tripled. A house that might have fetched 1,000 guilders back in 1630 might have sold for 3,000 guilders just 40 years later. Now, obviously, the Dutch didn't have good house price data back then, so when we talk about what happened to house prices 300 years ago, all of these numbers are extremely ballpark. And while historians might argue about exactly how much house prices went up in 17th century Netherlands, what they don't disagree about is that the reality eventually caught up with these Dutch traders. So rents weren't rising, the population stopped growing as fast, but in this case, it's actually not like the bubble burst. Instead, there was this long, steady loss of confidence. So the market quietly went down, and it took 37 years for Dutch house prices to fall roughly 2/3, 66%. And I think the lesson here is that if people are just buying houses based on price momentum rather than fundamentals like rent and growing populations, well, the market is in a lot of trouble. And that actually happened in the third largest house price crash in history. You see, back in the 80s, Japan's economy was on fire. Banks were lending aggressively, and in the 3 decades between 1960 and 1990, Japanese house prices trigontupled. Now, what's that word mean? It's a fancy word for they got 30 times more expensive. Now, if you've never heard of that word, it's because house prices almost never go up 30 times in just 3 decades. In fact, Tokyo's land got so expensive that the ground underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to be worth more than all of the real estate in California combined. Now, that's like saying the Japanese emperor could sell up his palace and buy every single house in the most populous state in America. And as we've seen, a rapid rise always comes before a massive fall. And that started in 1989 when the Bank of Japan raised interest rates to try and slow down speculation. And what happened is that buyers could no longer afford the loans that they needed to keep house prices that high, and so prices nosedived. Over the next decade, Tokyo land prices fell by as much as 60 to 80%, depending on which data you look at. And while property prices have recovered in every other downturn I've shared in this video, Japan's actually the exception. If you bought a house in 1991, 33 years later, today, it's still down 23% since you bought it. But to get to the second largest house price crash in history, we've got to go way back in time. And by that, I mean way back. Because the second largest crash happened in Italy all the way back in 33 AD under the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. Now, what happened back then is that land was the investment choice for Rome's elite. So Roman senators would borrow a lot of money to go up and buy lots of estates and show off their land, show off their wealth. Now, just like in the 17th century in the Netherlands, The first century Romans weren't all that interested in keeping really good house price records. But what we do know is that all of this borrowing, all of this buying led to house prices going up and soaring. But then the government stepped in. So the Roman Senate passed a banking law that meant that all of the banks had to own more land in Italy. But the banks couldn't afford to go out and buy it. So how do they get the money to afford the land? Well, they started calling in all of the loans from the senators who had actually just passed that law. But all of those senators, all of those borrowers, they didn't have the money to pay it back. So what did they do? They had to sell their own land to pay back their loans just so the banks could buy that land again. But because of all of this, there weren't that many buyers in the market, and this single law caused property prices to crash. Now, our best guess is that house prices fell around 70%. And again, we see that lesson that keeps coming back and back again. When you have a huge house price boom and then the banks stop lending, house prices can come crashing down really quickly. It was true in 33 AD, it's true 2,000 years later. And so far, we've seen this pattern. A boom, easy money, the banks pull back, prices tank. But banks were actually not the cause of the largest house price crash in the history of the world. Instead, it happened in 14th century Europe. Now, back then, Europe's population, it was growing. Cities were bustling, the land was valuable, and then the Black Death struck. Up to 50% of the population died and entire villages vanished. So the European continent didn't need as many houses. Housing demand collapsed and land values, they plummeted. In some areas, prices reportedly collapsed by 70 to 80%. Though again, with the collapsing population in the 1300s, those Europeans, they were more interested in staying alive rather than keeping good house price records. But how do we spot a downturn before it happens? Well, in this case, you kind of can't. External shocks like pandemics, wars, they can wipe out housing demand overnight. So the best we can do is always account for the unexpected. And so far, we've looked at the biggest property price crashes in history and what to watch out for before the market turns. But even in a good market, the wrong property can still lose you money. So before you buy anything, check out this next video where I show you what you always need to check before buying a property in New Zealand.